The crack of a gunshot echoed across the dusty plains of Idaho Territory, 1885, as Vivienne Fairchild clutched her 6-month-old daughter tighter to her chest, backing away from the three men advancing toward her isolated farmhouse just outside Malad City. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized she'd wandered too far from the safety of her front door while hanging laundry, and now these bandits had her cornered in her own yard. "Ain't nowhere to run, pretty lady," drawled the tallest of the three, his face half hidden beneath a filthy bandana. His eyes traveled slowly from her face to the gold wedding band on her finger. "Reckon that ring would fetch a nice price, and maybe you got more valuables inside." "Please," Vivienne pleaded, her voice steady despite her fear. At 26, she'd endured more than most women twice her age: the loss of her husband to pneumonia last winter, the struggle of maintaining their homestead alone, the endless battle against poverty that threatened to consume her and little Sarah. "I have nothing of value, just leave us be." The second bandit, shorter but with a more menacing presence, stepped forward. "Don't believe that for a second. Joshua Fairchild was known to have made a tidy sum before he passed. Where's he keepin' it? Widow?" Vivienne's blood ran cold at the mention of her late husband's name. These weren't random drifters, they had targeted her specifically. "There's no money," she insisted, backing toward the fence that surrounded her property. The baby in her arms began to whimper, sensing her mother's distress. The third bandit cocked his pistol. "Search the house. We'll keep an eye on the missus and her little one." From the ridge overlooking Vivienne's property, Xavier Vance observed the unfolding scene through narrowed eyes. He'd been tracking these bandits for 2 weeks across 3 counties, the Shelton gang, responsible for a string of robberies and at least 2 murders near boys. At 31, Xavier had built a reputation as one of the most skilled bounty hunters in the territory, though few knew his real name or story. With practiced precision, Xavier dismounted his dappled gray stallion and secured the reins to a nearby juniper. His dark hat pulled low over his eyes, he moved silently down the slope, calculating his approach. 3 armed men against 1 woman and her child, the odds turned his stomach. The gate to the property stood about 20 yards from where the bandits had cornered the woman. If he could create enough of a diversion, she might have a chance to escape with her child into the house, where she could barricade herself while he dealt with the Sheltons. Drawing both his Colt revolvers, Xavier positioned himself behind a weathered oak tree at the edge of the property. He took a deep breath, steadying his aim on the bandit closest to the woman. "Gates open," he called out in a clear, commanding voice that carried across the yard. "Run when I move." Before the bandits could locate the source of his voice, Xavier stepped into view, firing a shot that sent the nearest bandit's hat flying off his head. In the momentary confusion, he moved with lightning speed toward the men, drawing their attention and their fire away from Vivienne. Vivienne didn't hesitate. Clutching Sarah tightly against her chest, she bolted toward the gate, her skirts gathered in one hand as she ran. Behind her, gunshots exploded in rapid succession. Xavier dove behind a water trough as bullets splintered the wood around him. 2 quick shots from his position, and one of the bandits dropped with a cry, clutching his shoulder. "Get inside," Xavier shouted to Vivienne as she reached the gate. "Lock the door." Vivienne raced through the gate and toward her house, but as she reached the porch steps, she glanced back to see the mysterious cowboy outnumbered, bullets kicking up dust around him. In that split second of distraction, her foot caught on the bottom step and she stumbled, managing to twist her body to protect Sarah as she fell. Pain shot through her ankle, and she knew immediately she couldn't run any further. With desperation fueling her movements, she crawled up the steps and onto the porch, dragging herself toward the door. One of the bandits noticed her predicament and broke away from the firefight, charging toward the vulnerable mother. Xavier saw the movement and emerged from his cover, taking careful aim before firing. The bandit crumpled to the ground before reaching the porch steps. The remaining Shelton brother, realizing the tide had turned, mounted his horse and spurred it hard, disappearing in a cloud of dust toward the eastern hills. Xavier quickly secured the wounded bandit before rushing to Vivienne's side. "Are you hit?" he asked, his voice gentler than before as he knelt beside her on the porch. No, she managed, wincing as she shifted position. My ankle, I think it's sprained. The baby is unharmed. She looked up at him, taking in his features for the first time, strong jaw shadowed with several days' growth, intense green eyes that seemed to see right through her, and a small scar that traced along his left cheekbone. Xavier Vance, he said, holstering one of his pistols and offering his hand. Bounty hunter, been tracking the Shelton gang for a fortnight. Vivienne Fairchild, she replied, shifting Sarah to accept his handshake. And this is my daughter, Sarah. I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Vance. Let's get you inside first, he said, noticing her grimace of pain. May I? He asked, indicating he would carry her. Vivienne nodded, and Xavier carefully lifted her, mindful of the baby in her arms. As he carried them inside the modest farmhouse, the wounded bandit outside groaned and began to stir. I'll need to secure him properly, Xavier said as he gently set Vivienne down on a worn settee in the small parlor. Then I can tend to your ankle if you'll permit it. Of course, she replied, arranging Sarah beside her. The baby had calmed now, her large eyes following Xavier's movements with infant curiosity. There's rope in the barn. Xavier nodded and strode back outside. Vivienne listened to the sounds of him dragging the wounded bandit to the barn, followed by muffled curses and then silence. When he returned, he carried her medical supplies that she kept in a wooden box on the porch. The other one, she asked quietly. Dead, Xavier replied simply. The third rode east, likely heading back to their hideout near the Montana border. He knelt before her and carefully examined her ankle, which had already begun to swell. May I? He asked again before touching her. Vivienne nodded, appreciating his courtesy. His hands were calloused but gentle as he removed her boot and checked the injury. Just a sprain, I believe. Nothing broken. He efficiently wrapped her ankle with a bandage from her medical box. You have experience with such injuries? She asked. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. 8 years as a bounty hunter teaches a man many skills, medicine being among the most useful. He finished the bandage and sat back on his heels. You should stay off it for a few days. Vivienne glanced around her home at the laundry half hung outside, the vegetables waiting to be canned, the endless chores that wouldn't wait for a healed ankle. That's not possible, Mr. Vance. I have a farm to run. Xavier observed her for a moment, taking in the determination in her blue eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw. The Sheltons targeted you specifically, he said. They knew your husband's name, believed he had money hidden away. She sighed, stroking Sarah's soft hair. Joshua was a hard worker. We saved everything we could, but there was barely enough to get us through last winter after he passed. Whatever the Sheltons believe exists simply doesn't. The third Shelton will be back, Xavier said firmly, possibly with reinforcements. Luke Shelton doesn't give up easily, especially when he thinks there's money to be had. Fear flickered across Vivienne's face as she pulled Sarah closer. What am I to do? I cannot leave our home. Everything Joshua and I built is here. Xavier stood and moved to the window, scanning the property with the practiced eye of a hunter. I'll stay, he said after a moment, at least until your ankle heals and the third Shelton is captured. He turned to face her. If you'll permit it. Vivienne hesitated. Having a stranger in her home, especially a man known for tracking and killing outlaws, should have terrified her. Yet something about Xavier Vance's steady gaze and quiet confidence brought her comfort instead of fear. There's a small room off the kitchen, she offered. It's not much, but it has a bed. Xavier nodded, the decision made. I'll need to ride into town first, alert the sheriff about what happened here and arrange for the disposal of the body. He paused. And I should send a telegram to the marshal in Boise. They'll want to know I've located part of the gang. Of course, Vivienne agreed. But please, you must let me pay you something for your help. Xavier shook his head. The Sheltons have a bounty on their heads. That's payment enough. He moved toward the door, then stopped. Is there anything you need from town? The unexpected consideration caught Vivienne off guard. It had been so long since anyone had asked what she needed. Some coffee, if it's not too much trouble, she said, and perhaps some sugar for Sarah's porridge. Consider it done, Xavier replied with a slight nod before stepping outside. Vivienne listened to his footsteps cross the porch, followed by the sounds of him preparing his horse. Through the window, she watched him mount the gray stallion with fluid grace. As he rode away, Sarah began to fuss in her arms. "It's all right, little one," she whispered, though the words were meant to reassure herself as much as her daughter. "I believe we're in good hands." In the 3 hours Xavier was gone, Vivienne managed to drag herself around the house, finishing what chores she could while keeping weight off her injured ankle. She prepared a simple stew from the vegetables in her garden, wanting to offer her protector a proper meal upon his return. The sun hung low on the horizon when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Through the window, she saw Xavier returning, his saddlebags fuller than when he'd left. Relief washed over her, a feeling that surprised her with its intensity. Xavier stabled his horse alongside her aging mare before entering the house, his arms laden with supplies. "Sheriff Buchanan sends his regards," he announced, setting the packages on her kitchen table. "He's organizing a search party for Luke Shelton at first light." "And the body?" Vivienne asked hesitantly. "Taken care of," Xavier assured her. "The wounded one, Earl Shelton, is in the town jail. He'll stand trial when his shoulder heals." He began unpacking the supplies, which included not only the coffee and sugar she'd requested, but also fresh bread, bacon, a small sack of hard candies, and several cans of peaches. "Mr. Vance, this is too much," Vivienne protested. "Xavier," he corrected gently. "And it's not nearly enough for what you've endured today." He paused, seeming to debate his next words. "Mrs. Fairchild, the sheriff mentioned that your husband passed this past winter. I'm sorry for your loss." Vivienne nodded, the familiar ache of grief rising briefly before she pushed it aside. "Thank you. Joshua was a good man. He loved this land." She busied herself with organizing the supplies, hiding the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "And please call me Vivienne." A comfortable silence fell between them as Xavier helped her put away the provisions. The domesticity of the moment struck Vivienne as oddly natural, despite the extraordinary circumstances that had brought this man into her home. "Something smells delicious," Xavier commented, noticing the pot simmering on the stove. "Just a simple vegetable stew," Vivienne replied. "It's the least I can offer in return for your help today." "You owe me nothing," Xavier insisted, but his eyes betrayed his appreciation for the home-cooked meal. "Though I won't refuse good food, it's been a while since I've had anything that wasn't cooked over a campfire." As they sat down to eat, Sarah awoke from her nap in the small cradle beside the table. Xavier watched with interest as Vivienne expertly balanced feeding herself and tending to the baby. "She has your eyes," he observed. "Same shade of blue." Vivienne smiled, the first genuine smile since the harrowing events of the day. "Everyone says so, though I see Joshua in her expressions sometimes." She hesitated before asking, "Do you have family somewhere, Xavier?" A shadow passed over his face, and he took a moment before answering. "Not anymore. Lost my parents to a fever when I was 18. My younger sister married a shopkeeper in Sacramento 5 years back." He focused on his stew, clearly uncomfortable with revealing personal details. Understanding his reluctance, Vivienne changed the subject. "How did you come to be a bounty hunter?" Xavier seemed relieved by the shift. "Started as a deputy in a small town near the Arizona border. Found I had a knack for tracking. When my sister married and moved west, there was nothing keeping me tied to any one place." He shrugged. "The pay is good when you're successful, and there's never a shortage of men who need finding." "It sounds like a lonely life," Vivienne observed softly. Xavier's eyes met hers across the table. "It can be," he admitted, "but there's a certain freedom to it as well." As night fell, Vivienne showed Xavier to the small room off the kitchen. It was sparsely furnished with a narrow bed, a chair, and a hook on the wall for clothing, but it was clean and offered privacy. "It's not much," she apologized, "but the mattress is comfortable enough." "It's more than sufficient," Xavier assured her. "I've slept under the stars more nights than I can count. A roof and a real bed are luxuries." Vivienne nodded, suddenly aware of how close they were standing in the small doorway. "Well then, good night, Xavier. And thank you again for everything today." "Good night, Vivienne," he replied softly. "Don't worry about the Sheltons tonight. I'm a light sleeper." As she limped back to her bedroom, Vivienne realized she felt safer than she had since Joshua died, despite the danger that had entered her life that day. The contradiction wasn't lost on her, nor was the unexpected warmth she felt in Xavier's presence. Dawn broke with a gentle pink glow across the eastern hills. Xavier had risen before first light, checking the property's perimeter and tending to the animals before Vivienne awoke. He was splitting wood at the chopping block when she appeared on the porch, Sarah balanced on her hip. "You didn't need to do that," she called, watching as he swung the axe with practiced efficiency. Xavier paused, wiping sweat from his brow despite the morning coolness. "Seemed the least I could do. Your woodpile was getting low." He set down the axe and approached the porch. "How's the ankle this morning?" "Better," Vivienne replied, though she still favored her good leg. "Though I don't think I'll be chasing after chickens just yet." "Leave the chores to me today," Xavier said. "Just point me in the right direction." Vivienne hesitated, unaccustomed to accepting help. Joshua had been her partner in every sense, sharing the workload equally, but since his death, she'd shouldered every responsibility alone. Having someone offer assistance stirred a mixture of relief and discomfort. "The vegetables need harvesting," she finally suggested. "And the cow needs milking," Xavier nodded. "Consider it done." As the day progressed, Vivienne watched from the porch as Xavier moved about her property with surprising competence for a man who lived life on horseback. He harvested the late summer vegetables, repaired a loose board on the chicken coop, and even managed to coax more milk from her temperamental cow than she usually managed. By mid-afternoon, he'd accomplished more than Vivienne could have done in 2 days of good health. She found herself studying him when he wasn't looking the way the sun brought out auburn highlights in his brown hair, the efficient grace of his movements, the gentleness with which he handled the farm animals. "You're quite knowledgeable about farm work for a bounty hunter," she commented when he brought a basket of tomatoes to the porch. A rare smile crossed his face. "Grew up on a small ranch in Colorado, wasn't always chasing outlaws." He set the basket beside her chair. "Some skills you never forget." "Like riding and shooting?" she asked, bouncing Sarah on her knee. "Among others," he agreed. His expression grew more serious as he gazed out toward the eastern hills where Luke Shelton had disappeared. Sheriff should have sent word by now if they'd found anything. "You think they won't catch him?" Vivienne stated, reading the concern in his posture. Xavier turned back to her. "Luke Shelton is crafty. He's evaded capture for nearly 2 years." He hesitated before adding, "And now he has personal reason to return here." The implied threat hung in the air between them. Vivienne looked down at Sarah, her throat tightening at the thought of more danger coming to her child. "I won't let him harm either of you," Xavier said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "That's a promise, Vivienne." She met his gaze, surprised by the intensity she found there. "I believe you," she replied softly. That evening after supper, as Xavier helped Vivienne clear the dishes, the conversation turned to more personal matters. Seated at the kitchen table with cups of the coffee he'd brought from town, they found themselves sharing stories as if they were old friends rather than recent acquaintances brought together by violence. "How did you and your husband come to settle in Malad City?" Xavier asked, curious about what would bring anyone to this remote corner of Idaho Territory. Vivienne smiled at the memory. "Joshua had a cousin who'd homesteaded here, wrote to us about the fertile valley, the possibilities. We were barely making ends meet in Pennsylvania, so we packed what little we had and came west." Her expression grew wistful. "It was harder than we imagined, but also more rewarding. This land gives back what you put into it if you're willing to work." "And you were," Xavier observed. "We both were," she corrected. "Joshua never shied from hard work. We had such plans." She trailed off, then squared her shoulders. "But life continues, for Sarah's sake, if nothing else." Xavier nodded, admiring her resilience. "What about your family? Do they know your situation?" A shadow crossed Vivienne's face. "My parents disowned me when I married Joshua. They had someone else chosen for me, a banker's son with political connections. When I chose love instead, they cut all ties." She stared into her coffee cup. "I wrote to them when Joshua died, but received no reply." Xavier's jaw tightened at this revelation. "Their loss," he said simply. The genuine indignation in his voice brought unexpected comfort to Vivienne. "What about you? You mentioned a sister in Sacramento. Do you visit her often?" "Not as often as I should," Xavier admitted. "Margaret writes regularly. She has 2 children now, a boy and a girl." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "She's always telling me to find a nice girl and settle down, give up the dangerous life." "And what do you tell her?" Vivienne asked, curious despite herself. Xavier's eyes met hers across the table. "That some men aren't made for settling." The statement hung between them, neither challenging nor entirely convincing. Before Vivienne could respond, Sarah began to fuss in her cradle. "Someone's ready for bed," Vivienne said, grateful for the interruption as she rose to collect her daughter. Xavier stood as well. "I'll check the property once more before turning in." Vivienne nodded, watching as he buckled on his gun belt and stepped outside into the gathering darkness. Something about his presence had begun to feel right in her home, as if he belonged there, a dangerous thought for a widow whose heart still ached for her lost husband. Yet as she prepared Sarah for bed, Vivienne couldn't deny the flutter of anticipation she felt at the sound of Xavier's boots on the porch when he returned, or the way her pulse quickened when their fingers accidentally brushed as she handed him a lantern for his room. "Sleep well, Vivienne," he said softly at her bedroom door. "You too, Xavier," she replied, wondering why such a simple exchange felt so intimate. The next 3 days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Xavier tended to the farm work while Vivienne managed the indoor chores and cared for Sarah. Her ankle improved steadily, though she still moved with caution. Each evening, they shared meals and conversation that grew increasingly comfortable and revealing. Xavier spoke of his years tracking outlaws across the Western Territories, of nights spent under vast star-filled skies, of small acts of justice that made the loneliness worthwhile. Vivienne shared stories of her early marriage, the difficult journey west, the struggle and triumph of creating a home from wilderness. On the 4th morning, Sheriff Buchanan rode out to the farm with news. Xavier met him in the yard while Vivienne watched from the porch. "No sign of Luke Shelton," the sheriff reported, dismounting with a grimace. "Seems he's gone to ground, might have crossed into Montana Territory." Xavier's expression darkened. "He'll be back." "Maybe, maybe not," Buchanan replied. "His brother's being transported to Boise tomorrow to stand trial. Without his gang, Luke might decide to start fresh elsewhere." "I don't share your optimism, Sheriff," Xavier said. "The Sheltons were convinced there's money hidden on this property. Luke won't give up easily." The sheriff sighed, pushing back his hat. "Well, I can't keep a search party out indefinitely. Folks have their own concerns." He glanced toward the porch where Vivienne stood. "Mrs. Fairchild, you might consider staying in town for a while, at least until we're certain the danger's past." Vivienne shook her head firmly. "This is my home, Sheriff. I won't be driven from it by threats." "Stubborn as your late husband," Buchanan muttered, though not unkindly. "Well, Vance here seems determined to stand guard. Reckon you're in capable hands." He remounted his horse. "I'll keep men patrolling this area when possible, but resources are stretched thin." After the sheriff departed, Xavier joined Vivienne on the porch. "He's right about one thing: you'd be safer in town." "Would I?" she challenged. "In a boarding house with thin walls and strangers all around." "At least here I know every corner, every sound." She met his gaze directly. "And I have you." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, weighted with more meaning than either was ready to acknowledge. "For now," Xavier agreed quietly, though something in his voice had changed a note of uncertainty where there had been only confidence before. That afternoon, while Xavier repaired the fence along the western edge of the property, Vivienne tested her healing ankle by walking carefully around the garden. Sarah napped peacefully in her cradle on the porch, visible from where Vivienne worked among the late blooming flowers. The peaceful scene shattered when a single gunshot cracked through the air. Vivienne's head snapped up to see Xavier drop behind the fence line, his own weapon drawn. Heart pounding, she scooped Sarah from the cradle and hurried inside the house, locking the door behind her, as Xavier had instructed her to do if trouble came. Through the window, she could see nothing of Xavier, only the empty fence line where he'd been working. Cradling Sarah close to quiet her startled cries, Vivienne moved to another window, desperately searching for any sign of him. A second shot rang out, followed by a third in quick succession. Then silence fell, more terrifying than the gunfire. Minutes stretched like hours as Vivienne waited, every muscle tense. Finally, movement at the edge of her property caught her eye. Xavier, walking slowly back toward the house, one hand pressed against his upper arm. Vivienne rushed to unlock the door, relief flooding through her at the sight of him alive, though clearly injured. "Luke Shelton?" she asked as he climbed the porch steps. Xavier nodded grimly. "He won't be troubling anyone anymore." He winced as he removed his hand from his arm, revealing a bloodstain spreading across his shirt sleeve. "You're hurt," Vivienne exclaimed, ushering him inside. "Sit down, let me tend to it." "Just a graze," Xavier insisted, though he didn't resist as she guided him to a kitchen chair. Vivienne placed Sarah in her cradle before gathering medical supplies. With gentle efficiency, she helped Xavier remove his shirt to expose the wound, a deep furrow along his upper arm where a bullet had torn through flesh but missed bone. "You were fortunate," she murmured as she cleaned the wound. Her fingers worked with practiced care, though she couldn't help but notice the network of scars that marked his torso, testaments to a life of danger. "Luck had little to do with it," Xavier replied, watching her face as she worked. "He was aiming to kill, I was quicker." Vivienne's hands faltered briefly before resuming their task. "Did you?" "Yes," Xavier confirmed, understanding her unasked question. "He left me no choice, Vivienne. He fired first, and he wouldn't have stopped until he got what he came for or eliminated anyone in his way." She nodded, accepting the harsh reality of frontier justice. As she bandaged his arm, her fingers lingered longer than necessary on his skin. "I thought," she began, then stopped herself. "What?" Xavier prompted softly. Vivienne met his gaze, her blue eyes bright with unshed tears. "I thought I might lose you too." The admission hung between them, revealing more than she had intended. Xavier reached up with his good hand to brush a strand of hair from her face, the gesture impossibly tender from a man who made his living hunting dangerous men. "I'm not easy to get rid of," he said, his voice rough with an emotion neither of them was ready to name. That evening, after Xavier had ridden into town to inform the sheriff about Luke Shelton's death, they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. Sarah slept peacefully inside, leaving them in a rare moment of solitude. "The sheriff says I'll need to ride to Boise in a few days," Xavier said, breaking the comfortable silence. "To testify at Earl Shelton's trial." Vivienne nodded, trying to ignore the disappointment that tightened her chest. "Of course. How long will you be gone?" "A week, perhaps longer." Xavier turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "The danger's past now. You'll be safe here." "Yes," she agreed, though the prospect of his departure brought a hollow feeling she hadn't anticipated. In less than a week, this man had become essential to her daily life in ways that went beyond protection from bandits. "I've been thinking," Xavier continued, his voice hesitant in a way she'd never heard before. "After the trial, I could return, help with the harvest before winter sets in." Hope flickered in Vivienne's heart, though she kept her voice measured. "You don't need to feel obligated, Xavier. You've done more than enough already." "It's not obligation," he said firmly. He turned fully toward her, his green eyes intent on hers. "Vivienne, I've spent 8 years drifting from town to town, never staying long enough to put down roots, but these past days." He paused, searching for words. "Being here with you and Sarah, it's shown me what I've been missing." Vivienne's breath caught in her throat. "And what's that?" "A home," he said simply. "A purpose beyond the next bounty or the next chase." His hand found hers on the porch railing, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I know it's too soon. You're still grieving Joshua, and I wouldn't presume it is soon," Vivienne interrupted softly. "But life on the frontier doesn't always allow for proper timing, does it?" She turned her hand to intertwine her fingers with his. "Joshua would want Sarah and me to be happy, to be safe." Xavier's expression softened. "And do I make you happy, Vivienne?" The question was bold, direct in the way of a man accustomed to facing truth head-on. Vivienne found herself responding in kind. "Yes," she admitted, "in a way I didn't expect to feel again." She squeezed his hand. Return after the trial, Xavier. We can take time to see what might grow between us. The smile that transformed his usually serious face made him appear younger, unburdened. I'd like that, he said, lifting her hand to press a gentle kiss against her knuckles. The gesture, chaste but filled with promise, sent warmth spreading through Vivienne's chest. For the first time since Joshua's death, she allowed herself to imagine a future bright with possibility rather than shadowed by struggle. The week Xavier spent in Boise seemed to stretch endlessly. Vivienne kept busy with harvesting and preserving, preparing her home for the approaching winter. Each night, she would sit on the porch after putting Sarah to bed, looking eastward as if she might catch a glimpse of Xavier returning early. On the 8th day, when she had nearly convinced herself he might not come back at all, the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the east brought her hurrying to the yard. Xavier's tall figure astride his gray stallion materialized from the afternoon haze, and Vivienne couldn't stop the smile that spread across her face. He dismounted with fluid grace, leading his horse toward her. The trial went well, he reported. Earl Shelton received 20 years in the territorial prison. He hesitated, then added, I've officially resigned my position as a bounty hunter. Surprise widened Vivienne's eyes. Xavier, you didn't need to, I wanted to, he interrupted gently. It's time for a change. He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. I brought something for Sarah. Touched by the gesture, Vivienne accepted the package and unwrapped it to reveal a beautifully carved wooden rattle, polished to a smooth shine. And something for you, Xavier continued, producing a second, smaller package. With curious fingers, Vivienne unwrapped the gift. Inside lay a silver comb for her hair, simple but elegant, with delicate engravings of wildflowers along its edge. Xavier, it's beautiful, she breathed, tracing the pattern with her fingertip. I noticed you always pin your hair up for work, he said, a hint of shyness in his voice that seemed at odds with his confident demeanor. Thought you might like something pretty to use. The thoughtfulness of the gift brought unexpected tears to Vivienne's eyes. Thank you, she whispered, impulsively rising on tiptoe to press a kiss to his cheek. Xavier's hand came up to capture hers as she began to pull away. With gentle pressure, he drew her back, his eyes asking a question. When she didn't resist, he lowered his head and brushed his lips against hers in a kiss as light as a whisper. Vivienne's free hand moved to his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. When he deepened the kiss, she responded with a warmth that surprised them both, a spark igniting between them that promised so much more. As autumn progressed into winter, Xavier proved himself indispensable to the farm's operations and to Vivienne's happiness. He built sturdy shelters for the animals, repaired the roof before the first snow, and filled the root cellar with enough provisions to last through the coldest months. More importantly, he brought laughter back into a home that had known too much sorrow. He crafted toys for Sarah, told stories by the fireside in the evenings, and gradually coaxed Vivienne back into the fullness of life, helping her remember that joy could exist alongside grief. Their romance blossomed slowly, respectful of her mourning yet honest about the growing affection between them. Xavier never tried to replace Joshua in her memories, but instead created his own place in her heart, different, but equally precious. On Christmas Eve, with snow falling gently outside and Sarah sleeping peacefully in her cradle, Xavier knelt before Vivienne as she sat by the fire. I know we agreed to take time, he began, taking her hands in his, and if you need more, I understand. But I've never been more certain of anything than I am of my feelings for you, Vivienne. From his pocket, he withdrew a simple gold band. I'm not asking you to forget Joshua. He'll always be Sarah's father and a part of your life. But I'm asking if you might find room in your heart to begin a new chapter with me. Tears filled Vivienne's eyes as she looked at the earnest face of the man who had saved not just her life, but her future. I already have, she whispered, extending her hand so he could slip the ring onto her finger. Xavier's smile was radiant as he rose to gather her in his arms, sealing their promise with a kiss that spoke of passion, commitment, and the precious gift of second chances. They were married on New Year's Day, 1886, in the small church in Malad City. The same community that had supported Vivienne through her widowhood now celebrated her new beginning. Sheriff Buchanan stood as Xavier's best man, and Margaret traveled from Sacramento with her family to witness her brother's happiness. As winter gave way to spring, Xavier and Vivienne worked side by side to expand the farm. With his savings from years of bounty hunting, they purchased additional acreage and livestock. The homestead that had once seemed on the verge of failure now thrived under their combined efforts. Sarah took her first steps in the garden Xavier had expanded for Vivienne, toddling between them with delighted giggles. That night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Vivienne shared news that completed their joy. "I'm carrying your child," she whispered against Xavier's chest. "Due in the autumn." His arms tightened around her, his voice thick with emotion. "A family of our own," he murmured in wonder, "something I never thought I'd have." "A family that began the moment you called out to me across the yard," Vivienne reminded him, pressing a kiss to his jaw. "Gate open, run when I move." "Best words I ever spoke," Xavier replied, capturing her lips with his. Their son, James Joshua Vance, was born as the first snow of winter dusted the Idaho hills. With Sarah's curious assistance, they created new traditions for their blended family, honoring the past while embracing their future together. As the years passed, the Vance homestead became one of the most prosperous in the valley. Xavier's strength and Vivienne's determination proved a formidable combination against the challenges of frontier life. They added a daughter, Elizabeth, to their family 2 years after James, completing the home that had once seemed destined for loneliness. On the 5th anniversary of the day they met, Xavier took Vivienne to the ridge overlooking their property, the same vantage point from which he had first spotted her in danger. "You ever regret it?" Vivienne asked as they surveyed their thriving farm, now expanded to include a new barn and additional fields. "Trading your freedom for this life?" Xavier turned to her, the love in his eyes as clear as it had been the day he proposed. "I never knew what freedom truly was until I found you," he said, drawing her into his arms. "Some men are made for wandering, it's true, but I was made for this, for you, for our children, for the home we've built together." As the sun set over the hills of Malad City, Vivienne leaned into her husband's embrace, grateful for the twist of fate that had brought danger to her door that day, and with it, the love that had saved her in more ways than one. In the distance, their children's laughter carried on the evening breeze, a sweet reminder of how life could change in an instant, how love could grow from the most unexpected beginnings, and how sometimes the bravest words ever spoken could be as simple as "Gate open, run when I move."